that they can see the screen there. Okay. I think everyone's coming through there on the questions. So everyone can confirm that we're seeing the screens there. Okay, everyone's put their hands up. Fantastic. Thank you, guys. Rightio. Well, no, we don't want to waste your time. I know everyone's got very time poor these days, especially with what's going on and the economy, markets, Trump and everything. So we'll cut straight to the chase. My name is Brett Evans, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleagues, Jeremy Harper and Ben Turner. Jeremy is the Managing Director for the Atlas Mortgage Division, and Ben is the Managing Director for the Atlas Tax Division. I look after the Europe, Middle East and Africa for Atlas Wealth, and my other colleague, James Ridley, who is back in Oz, he looks after the Asia and the Americas regions. So let's get the show on the road. No presentation will be replete by professionals who are licensed and governed without a nice little disclaimer. If you do not want to bother reading that, this virtually just summarizes to say that all the information we're going to present and talk about today should be considered as general advice or informational reasons only and should not be construed as personal advice. As a dual regulated firm, we have two disclaimers. So this essentially says the exact same thing, just referencing our licensing in the UAE. So who is the Atlas Wealth Group? We're the leading provider of Australian expat financial advice, tax, mortgage and asset management services. 14 years we're coming up to now. So we've been doing this a very long time, purely and proudly working with Australian expats in over 50 countries. Lots of regulators, lots of audits. So we're regulated by ASIC, the ATO and the DFSA. We have clients in over 50 countries. And we manage, actually that number's quite old. To date, even after the latest pullback, we're managing over about 320 million Australian dollars for clients around the world. All of it, the people you see on the call today, as well as all the professionals you may meet as a course of working with us, all actually have degrees in their chosen professions. So we do have a very high degree of regulation, but also to qualifications as well. Atlas Wealth Group comprises of three different, silos, entities, what do you want to call them? We've got Jeremy on Atlas Mortgages, and Jeremy's job is to really get out there and hunt for mortgages for new purchases, for refinance, for developments, all those things. Obviously, getting a loan these days is becoming difficult for expats, but not impossible, and Jeremy and his team make the impossible possible. Myself and James, we run up the Atlas Wealth Management Division, and we're looking after clients on the financial planning, tax, financial advice, and asset management side. And then obviously Ben and his team, who are Atlas Tax, they're the guys who do our clients' tax returns, private rulings, advisories, the list goes on there. So today we're going to run through about 5 key things, and then at the end we'll have our Q&A. So I'll run through a bit of a budget summary, financial planning update. By the way, there's not a lot to talk about. I'll explain why in a sec. Jeremy's going to run through on the housing update. Ben will do the tax update, and then at the end we'll open the floor up for Q&A. As we go through this presentation, if you do think of questions, please feel free to put those questions in the Q&A box, and we'll run through those at the end. So as far as the budget summary is concerned, these are a couple of high-level numbers which may or may not make any relevance to you, but it sort of frames where we're going, both with this budget announcement and obviously with the election that's going to be happening next month. So forecast underlying cash balance of 42.1 billion. That's a 4.8 billion improvement on the recent economic and fiscal outlook that was released last year. What that means is there's a couple of drivers behind that. We're not getting more tax receipts from a royalty point of view on the resources, because there is full employment and because more people are employed and more people are paying taxes on that income. That's where we've seen that lift. Nearly $85 billion of off-budget spending over the forward estimate period, resulting in a cumulative headline cash balance deficit of $236 billion over the 4 years to 28-29. This in turn brings out, obviously, the boogeyman in the closet, which is $1.22 trillion of debt. And that's not including state debt, folks. And Victoria would be almost up there by themselves by the way things are going there. But it is an increase of $283 billion of debt over the projected period. Growth in government spending continues to outpace GDP growth, and that's what you're going to see in a chart very shortly, which shows why we are going through these sort of dichotomy of full employment, but everyone doesn't feel like they're killing it on the workforce side. It's a real sort of tale of two halves. Interesting to note, net overseas migration is forecast to be 225,000 in the 2027-29 financial years. This is a reduction from 435,000 in 2023-4, 335,000 in 2024-5, and 260,000 for the next financial year. So we are seeing a slowing net overseas migration number, and it's not necessarily meaning that less people are coming here, but we are seeing also an increase of both Australian citizens moving overseas and also folks who moved to Australia through the COVID period with their visas coming to an end. So it's not just less people moving to Australia, it's that combination of who's leaving, who's coming, and what that net number looks like. Interesting point, which I'm sure Ben will love to have a chat about, is 999 million extra funding for the ATO to extend and expand their ATO tax compliance activities over the next 4 years. So the ATO are going to ramp up their game and just be forewarned as forearmed, as they say. Some of the numbers that the government utilises to formulate what they're announcing in the budget, and in turn what they'll be talking about in the election next month. Some of these key numbers include real GDP. So obviously real GDP is actually the amount of gross domestic production that the Australian economy produces. All these numbers here are forecast. So they're forecasting real GDP growth of 1.5% in the 2024-25 financial year, 2.25%, 25-26. That's next after 1 July this year, 2.5%, 2.75%, and 2.75% out. Employment, they're actually forecasting that to grow. I think that's intrinsically linked to government spending, and I'll show a chart very shortly which really does highlight those sort of key considerations. Unemployment rate, they're expecting that to be remaining at 4.25%. A little bit optimistic given what we're going to at the moment. And CPI, which is obviously inflation in layman's terms, they're looking at 2.5%, 3%, 2.5%, 2.5%, and 2.5% out over to 28-29. So I'm not sure whether that's achievable, especially with tariffs and all these other considerations coming in. If we do see interest rates go down, obviously that can cause inflation, that we'll see a spike. Wage price index, this is an interesting one. They're forecasting out greater than 3% wage price index increases over the next 4 years. So once again, that is going to be either predicated on the private sector or the government sector, or both. This chart here, to me, is quite a telling chart. And this is obviously highlighting the difference between annual employment growth in what we call market and non-market. So market is your general private sector. Non-market is your public administration, education, healthcare. So e.g. government funding-led sectors. So as you can see, there's been very little growth in employment in the private sector. So whether it's banking or hospitality or travel or whatever it might be, very little growth there, 0.6%. But if you look at the non-market side, it's 8.9%, which is dramatic. And that is making up the lion's share right now of what's happening in the employment space. So the government is really almost manipulated, but they've caused a full employment situation by spending a lot of money and directing those funds towards the public sector, education, and healthcare. So just quickly on a financial planning update, as I said, not a lot to talk about here, and I'll mainly talk about what wasn't discussed. Superannuation, no new measures were announced, which is surprising, but not. You've obviously got to remember, neither the Libs or Labor are going to show too much in this budget, especially when we've got an election, and especially on the opposition side with an election next month. So they're going to, keep their powder dry. They're going to put some bullets back in the guns, but they're not going to pull the trigger yet because they're going to want to announce this as part of the lead up to next month's election. So no new measures were announced with super. The good news is on HEX, they have agreed that they're going to reduce the HEX debt levels by 20% with a one-off index reduction before the indexation occurs on the 1st of June 2025. They're also going to increase the threshold minimum number of dollars earned from $54,000 to $67,000 before someone has to declare and start making payments. So that is good news for expats. If we need to see a bit more detail, because what one client asked me about was, with that indexation, can they double down on that, wait for that 20% cut to happen, then make a big payment? Because if you do make a payment before the 1st of June, then that increase is based on the balance leading up to that period of time. So it's a bit of a hack sometimes that clients can use going into that. So we'll do a blog article when we've got more detail from Canberra, but long story short, good news if you are an expat with HECS and help debt. So what wasn't in the budget? And this is what I think will really come out over the next sort of 3 to 4 weeks in the lead up to the election. Trust reimbursement integrity rules. There's been a lot of conversation, a lot of debate going on there, nothing on there. Taxation of trust, that's been a very common topic. Once again, nothing there. Amending of trust loss rules. The fourth one is the big one. The government's plans for the Div 296 super tax, and that was the $3 million cap that the Labor proposed, whereby they would increase the taxation from 15 to 30% on balances greater than 3 million. Also to the taxing of unrealised gains, which is the scary one. And last of all, previously shell policies that we haven't seen resurface, restricting negative gearing or halving the 50% capital gains discounts. So watch this space. Will they turn up? Time will tell in the next 3 to 4 weeks. So I'll now hand it over to Jeremy, who will give us a housing update and run us through the budget implications as well too.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks everyone for your time. So we'll just jump through the housing update. Yeah, similar theme to what Brett was saying. Nothing really inspiring from either party, nothing too game changing, but we can have a look at that. But if we just look at the first slide, this is probably what top of everyone's mind is, what's the rate doing? So just to remind everyone, the RBA has changed their meeting schedule. Typically it's always the first Tuesday every month. So the first meeting this year in February, they cut the central rate by 25 points. We had their second meeting last week, which they held. So the cash rate's at 4.1%. And then the next meeting is scheduled for the 19th of May. So just keep that in the back of your mind. The election's, I think, the 10th or the Saturday the 10th. So the next RBA meeting will be after the federal election, which I think is probably timed really well because it won't be as influenced by the decision. But if we turn over the page, what's really interesting and what's changed over the last week is, if you jump onto ASX.com, there's this market rate predictor that gives us an idea around what's the market anticipating the RBA will do. And if you can see, if we go back to the end of March, it was essentially a 50-50 probability of holding at our next meeting or cutting the rates to 3.6% cash rate, which would represent a 50-point cut. And then since Trump has made a couple of policy changes on his end, the market's now pricing a 96% chance of a rate cut at the next meeting. So fairly aggressive. I've never seen that move so aggressively over just a couple of business days, but that kind of gives you an indication of where rates might be going the next meeting. And then if we go over to the page again, just wanted to highlight, and hopefully people can see this. This is a yield curve to give us a bit of an estimate of where the market sees rates in the next sort of 12 to 18 months. So on the left-hand side is a snapshot from back in January, the start of the year. And so they had the rate sort of evening out at the central cash rate around 3.6%. And then I've taken a screenshot just this week, and you can see that even 12 months out, they're expecting that cash rate to go down to about 2.8%. So huge reduction in that official cash rate over just a couple of months' time. So I think if anyone's going to tell you they know where rates are going over the next 12 months, they're lying. The market doesn't know. So, but keep an eye on these two graphs. Jump onto ASX.com if that's something that interests you. So if we jump over the page, so as I said, what's some of the policy updates heading into the federal election? I think if we focus on Labor's housing policy, 3 things have come out. The second point there, the Australian Future Fund, about investing 10 billion for social and affordable homes. That's a policy that's been around for some time since they've been in power. It's giving money at the state level, and it sort of hasn't really transitioned into material increase in housing. But the 2 other policies, so the Help to Buy scheme is quite separate from the current first home buyer scheme, which is the first home loan deposit scheme. where that's been in place for a number of years now, which is quite successful to help out first home buyers with a low deposit. This is slightly different. This is a shared equity model where the government can come in and essentially own a portion of that property that you're purchasing. And there's obviously restrictions around income and pricing limits. But the big difference between this program and the current program that's available for first home buyers is that they'll be taking a stake in the property. So really the only way, if you go to sell that property in the future, the government will take that back. And I'd imagine that would be at current market levels versus the current scheme, which is quite successful, is you can refinance out and pay out that second loan, or that second sort of guarantee portion that the government's got from the initial purchase. So sort of similar to a family guarantor loan, the way that the current program works, which has been very successful. Labor's saying we can come in and actually contribute. And this is more aimed at people who can't necessarily afford that full borrowing if they've got a low deposit. So kind of aimed at slightly different borrowers compared to the current program. And then recently they've come out with a cheaper home batteries program. So not a lot of detail here, but they are trying to essentially looking to subsidize households to install batteries for energy storage, and if they've got solar panels at home. So not a lot of detail there, but it seems to be that the government will subsidize that. So over the page, so similar to what Brett mentioned earlier, there's been some easing around how the federal government would like APRA and the banks to assess borrowers with a HEX or a help debt. So currently as it stands, we put that down as a commitment. You know, if you're over the repayment threshold, we will have to mark that down and say repaying that HEX debt at $400 per month, and that will go against your borrowing capacity. And what the government's proposing is that lenders have the discretion to exclude that debt. Now, there's quite a few caveats around that. They have to make their own discretion around can they afford it without or with including the commitment, and also what is the length of that commitment. So CBA actually just today released their take on this policy. And so what they're saying is there's a calculator they've developed to come out and say, what's the length of this commitment? So let's say the HEX debt can be paid off the next 2 years. And if we exclude that from serviceability, can we pass and afford this loan we're applying for? Or if we include it and we fail serviceability, can we make that call and say, this is a reasonable commitment that we can exclude for this purchase? My take on this, I've run some numbers from my end. There's two things to think about. Excluding it from the DTI calculations, that's going to have no impact at all. And then secondly, on the excluding it from the net monthly surplus calculation, again, it's not going to make a huge impact. So the way I looked at it was probably about 2 to 5% of all borrowers, these relaxing of rules will have a material impact. What the Liberal government have proposed is that APRA reduce some of that servicing buffering, which is at 3% on your proposed loan. If they can reduce that to say 1% for first home buyers, that would have a far greater impact on their ability to get that first home and that first purchase. But that's gone through, and we're now starting to see that reflected in bank policy. And if we just go over the page, and then just wanted to reiterate, I've spoken about this previously, but obviously this ban for non-residents has been in place since 1st of April, so it's in place for 2 years. And just wanted to sort of make it really crystal clear, this does not apply to Australian expats overseas. So there's no restrictions around buying Australian property if you're an Australian citizen overseas. What you just need to be really careful of is if you've got a non-resident partner and you're looking to buy that property together, we just need to think about more on a state level around that foreigner surcharge, if that would apply, which would increase the stamp duty at settlement. But if you're looking to purchase property in Australia as an Australian citizen as a non-tax resident, this is not applicable to you. This is for people who have no ties to Australia and are looking to buy property whilst they're overseas. And that's it. Yes, so as I said, not a lot there from the government's leading to selection, but I'll hand it over to Ben.
Thanks for that, Jeremy. And unfortunately, there's not much from me either. Fortunately or unfortunately, however you may see that. But I'll start off with what little there is. The first thing to sort of mention is under the proposed budget, there is some legislative tax cuts that are brought in, but as you can see from this table here, it's pretty minimal. So nothing for the 25 and 26 year. We've already had that legislated already in the stage 3 tax cuts, which was a pared back version of what was originally announced. And you can see in the 27 and 28 tax years, the lowest marginal rate is going down from 16% down 15 and then 14% in the subsequent years. So I found this quote a little bit humorous because all expats seem to be left behind when it comes to sort of government policy, especially in recent years with CGT discount and the main residence exemption, that the Albanese Labor government will deliver 2 more tax cuts to every Australian taxpayer in 26 and 27. Well, if you're a non-resident for the full year, then as you're probably aware, your tax rates start at the 30% rate. So unfortunately, it means that they are not applicable to you. So it's not really correct to say that it will be every Australian taxpayer who will receive a cut. But for those that are returning or those that are still resident, it will apply, although it is it's a very small sort of reduction, which they're sort of saying in Australia is about a cup of coffee a week sort of thing. Also relevant to note that the Liberal Party is not backing these changes, so these are effectively contingent on the Labor Party being re-elected at the next election. Another measure which will have very limited impact for those people who are non-residents, being the Medicare levy. And look, they've made some slight concessions regarding the low income thresholds that are applicable to claim of where Medicare levy kicks in. Now they do adjust these sort of every year, but they've been a bit more concessional this year. And as I mentioned, it's not applicable for those that are non-resident because Medicare levy doesn't apply to them. But other than that, it is a really, really slim budget this year, but not overall unexpected given how close we are to this election. But another sort of worthy note is those measures that were previously announced but are currently sitting unenacted. And we've got 2 key ones that we've talked about in the past. The individual tax residency rules, that was originally announced in 2021 under the former government. So if there was a change in government, perhaps this does have a little bit more emphasis, although I think the landscape has changed in the last 4 to 5 years, with a lot of the focus moving away from non-residents who typically don't seem to be that big of a voting bloc or don't vote at all if they're outside of the country. And self-managed super funds, which I'm eagerly awaiting some real change in this area, because as you may be aware, even though there is a 2-year sort of grace period where people can technically still be a complying fund if they leave Australia and become non-resident, there are probably tests within that. The active member test, for example, that still could be failed as a non-resident even within that 2-year period. But the changes that they did announce back in 2022 was that they would make it easier or make it at least possible for non-residents to maintain a self-managed super fund for temporary absences of up to 5 years. So there's definitely some people that's relevant to, and I'd like to see some sensible change in that area. But unfortunately, it looks like that's going to be something we're going to be waiting some time for. In the budget reply, being small as it was, all the focus was around fuel excise, electricity pricing, housing. There was absolutely nothing regarding personal tax changes and nothing regarding expats. So nothing I can sort of bring to the table there, unfortunately. We'll have to wait and see if something changes with the new government elected. So it's sort of a watch this space at this stage, but that's it from me on the tax side of things.
Right, gents. Well, just before we jump into the Q&A, I think it's pretty safe to say, and I'm sure you guys would agree, that this is the budget you have when you don't want to have a budget when you've got an election coming up. So no one wants to show their cards yet, show their policies, release, the information that people need to make informed decisions. So yeah, we've got questions coming through, guys, and just while we're just getting those filtering through, just to remind everyone down the bottom, there's up a Q&A box. You can click that, type in your question, and we'll answer that live on there. Bit of housekeeping things to do. We do a lot to get the message out to expats. Obviously, you guys are fully informed. You make smart decisions. So we've got a couple of channels here. One that's I'm just noticing here, we've actually got 3 podcasts. One is the Expat Chat podcast. That's myself and James talking all things financial planning, asset management, all those sort of key considerations. And then we have my esteemed colleague on the call here today, Jeremy, with James doing the Expat Mortgage podcast. That's all through properties, lending, any considerations, buyers agents, any topic that relates to the property side. And then we also have the Atlas Weekly Recap, which is sent out every week by my colleague Martin Jack, who is in the Australian office. So if you do like a podcast, Expat Chat podcast, Expat Mortgage podcast, and the Atlas Weekly Recap. We also have a Expat Financial Forum Facebook group, now just crossed through 3,500 members. So if you can imagine 3,500 expats from around the world, all very different situations, sharing their ideas, asking questions relating to managing their finances, and just trying to make the most of their time overseas. So if you are on Facebook, then please, by all means, jump onto the Australian Expat Financial Forum, and we'd love to welcome you in there. So let's jump straight into the Q&A. And the first cab off the rank here is Kate. Looks like a question directed to you, Jeremy. So I have a question about surcharge land tax in New South Wales. My husband and I own a property which we purchased in January 2021 in New South Wales, 50% each. I'm Australian, but a non-resident for tax purposes, and my husband is German. We had paid surcharge purchase duty on my husband's 50% when we purchased the property, and he paid the surcharge land tax at a rate of 2% in September 2022 based on the 2021 value. Then in 2023, they received a refund on both of these amounts, as Germany is one of the exempt countries for the surcharge. We've just received a bill for the surcharge land tax for 2025, which is now calculated at 5%. Why was Germany one of the 8 countries exempted, and why has that changed and now they have to pay?
Yeah, really good question. Actually, Ben and I, over a coffee, because this is what we do, we actually talked about the New South Wales SRO, and they are completely ruthless. Actually, side note, they're going through the mortgage broker industry on their SRO and the payroll tax, and we're in court because they're trying to deem a business-to-business payment as an extension of payroll as an employee. So they are taking a default position of just trying to raise revenue. And so with that in mind, we discussed this. So the New South Wales, and people have to understand that this is at a state level. So every state has their own definition where you buy that property, and that's their jurisdiction. But New South Wales has a definition of a foreign person. Essentially, if you've bought a property and you're not an Australian citizen and you're outside the country, so if you're a permanent resident or a non-res, even if you're a permanent resident and you enter the contract and you haven't been in the country for 200 days, that's a definition of a foreign person for the definition of New South Wales. Again, that's different for Queensland and Victoria. So we discussed this where there'd be plenty of scenarios out there where an Australian citizen's married to maybe someone who's a PR in New South Wales and Sydney, then they go overseas. That property is now subject to a foreign surcharge on the land tax. And as you rightly pointed out, it's going up to 5% on their portion. And typically it's their old PPR. So it's a beautiful $3 million house in, the eastern suburbs. So that's going to be a huge land tax bill every year. I'm not sure about the exempt countries. I've seen that come on, and I think they're within their power to kind of remove those countries and add them in whenever they want. I don't know the ins and outs of that, but I think it's just around that foreigner definition, which unless we can get that amended, I think your husband's going to fall as a foreigner. So what are your options? You could transfer the property into your name 100%, but obviously just have to think about potentially stamp duty and any capital gains event on that. Or you could put it in a trust and have your children nominated as beneficiaries. But again, I was working through that with a client where the trust really, if you've got a a foreign person, you don't want to deem that trust as a foreign trust. So you have to specify that the foreigners are not specified beneficiaries versus citizens. And I can see there you mentioned your children are dual citizens, so that would probably complicate that, because I'd imagine the SRO would take the position that someone that's a dual citizen is a foreign person, which makes the trust potentially a foreign trust, which would then make the property subject to the land tax surcharge. So maybe try and get the property in your name only, and then some lenders will allow both yourself and the non-resident to be on the mortgage for loan servicing if you can't service a loan just with your income 100%.
Ben, did you say you had some ideas as well?
Yeah, so just a couple of points there. So land tax is a state-based tax, and so it's different every jurisdiction. And whilst there is a harmonisation between those state revenue offices on a lot of different revenue, land tax is one of those that they are quite different. And what that means is in every state, you'll have a different threshold for when land tax kicks in. You'll have a different definition of what a foreign person is. And so some of the variances we will see is that, particularly in states like New South Wales, whilst you've got a land tax threshold of $1,005,000 before land tax kicks in, the foreign person definition, which is the most aggressive out of all of the states, includes someone, as Jeremy mentioned, who's even a PR but not physically present in Australia for 200 days, then they can be slugged for land tax, even if the land value attributed to them is underneath that 1.05 million threshold. So if any amount, and they can be slugged for this land tax surcharge. So that's very different to other states. So most other states that have the surcharge, and not all states have the surcharge, but for those that do have it, a lot of them only apply it once you actually qualify over the top of the land tax threshold. And a lot of them will also say that if you're permanent residents, then you also are not a foreign person. So you do need to work through this quite carefully, because each of the states have different legislation on how it kicks in, when it kicks in, and how it then applies. And definitely New South Wales has been a real shock for some people, because it started off at a 2%, but now to ramp up to 5% in this last year is a huge annual sum to be paying. It really does kind of really show clear intent that they want foreigners to divest their holdings, their land holdings in these assets, which is not fair, really, if they're married to an Australian. So on the specific point about the exemption, so there is a double tax agreement between Australia and several countries, and depending on the wording of those agreements, it was originally found that in New South Wales that they should be exempt. So Germany and other countries like New Zealand, South Africa, Japan, Norway, India and Switzerland, they should all be exempt from this surcharge amount. However, there was a change to that. They re-looked at that, and it was determined under this this act that came out that actually that wasn't the case. So, in the example that was put to us, there was this reversal, and I can understand why that was refunded, but they've basically gone back on their position on this. So going forward, expect that to be an issue. So as Jeremy mentioned, some of the options would be to divest that interest. Not a great outcome if you have that as a main residence that you've had for a long period of time, because obviously if you're non-resident at the time of the transfer, the main residence exemption should not be applicable to you. So there could be a large tax bill that's on the capital gains aspect, as well as any stamp duty as well on that transfer. So it's good to crunch the numbers on that to see what the best option may be. Sometimes it's actually involved people coming back to Australia and changing plans because the numbers are so significant.
No, that's a good point, mate. And I think that's the thing. It's these days with data-driven state and federal governments, expats now have to be more prescriptive in the way they manage their assets. Because if you just sit there and think the right thing will be done by you because you're Australian, it's wrong. Everyone's out to cover their own P&Ls. Everyone's out there to meet their targets, the KPIs, and Aussie expats, unfortunately, are getting caught up in all this. Just got a question for Jeremy before I go in here, guys. Just don't forget to put your questions in the question and answer box. Jeremy, you mentioned a point before about being able to buy a property and have it in the Australian's name, but the serviceabilities in the Aussie and the non-Aussie's name. How does that work from a bank point of view and a lending point of view? Because will a bank take into account a foreign citizen's salary, or will they just take into account the expenses that that couple have and offset it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it sort of depends on. I've had some success with banks. Typically, the income, they'd like the income to get that approved. The Australian bank wants to see that the Australian citizen has a higher income than the non-resident, and then they can use both and have the Australian citizen on the title and both the non-res or the non-citizen being a co-borrower in that situation. And then that way you would take both the family's income and the expenses overseas on the application.
Okay. So it depends on the banks and the person's situation.
Depends on the banks, yeah. But you've also got some banks that would be happy to say, okay, we can't accept the non-citizen's income.
Yep.
But let's say they're on a rental lease or they've got a mortgage overseas. Some banks in Australia could go, it's called common debt reducer, and say, we can see that you've got a partner that's covering half the mortgage or rent overseas. We'll only use your income in the application, but we'll only use half that mortgage expense or rent expense on that application. So you're not getting hit twice. So you may be able to pass serviceability just using the Australian citizen's income.
Okay. No, that's good to know, because I know a lot of folks, I think, was it 30%, mixed nationality from a marriage point of view, from an expat's point of view. And it's how do those mixed nationality couples, do they buy property? Because obviously you'll always have differences between who's paying and who's not, and who's an Aussie and who's not. So,
yep.
Okay. And question for you, Ben. Obviously, the big one that's monopolising all expats right now is tax residency, tax residency, tax residency. Do you just want to give us a bit of an update on where we think that's at? Because obviously the Canberra's been deafening in its silence in terms of following up from that consultation paper we're part of back in 2023. Where do you think things are right now? And do you think there will be a difference in timeline depending on which party gets elected next month?
Yeah, look, hard to say. I do know it's effectively all but dead in the water at the moment. There's a few moving parts to that. They haven't released anything or any information as to what the outcome was from those submissions. The inquiries that we've had through channels to Treasury have just said that it's just not on their radar at all at this point in time. There is no intention to sort of do anything at this point. We're obviously going to go into an election next month. It'll be interesting to sort of see how it is. I dare say it's something that I think will be pushed back even with a change of government, because when you look at 2021 and when this was first brought out, there weren't the same sort of global issues that we're sort of facing now, and I do think those issues are trumping, no pun intended, the current situation where expats seem to be the last thing on people's list.
Yep. So they fight the battles worth fighting rather than sort of taking that magnanimous approach that we need to update some laws that date back to 1936.
And to be clear on that, they're not looking to try and get extra revenue out of the tax residency changes. They're trying to eliminate people who could be residents of nowhere. But even in that respect, now with these changes to main residence exemption and CGT discount, there are some circumstances where non-residents, so people who are non-resident of nowhere, could have a poorer outcome than a resident. So I don't think there's that same urgency to try and have someone that's doesn't mean you're outside the tax net. It just means the circumstances are different. They were just looking to make it simpler, and I think with all the submissions that were put through, it became pretty clear that the laws need to be very careful in how they approach this, because some of what was put forward probably overcomplicated it and made it even
Yeah.
more difficult than the current arrangements.
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on in that economic assets test, being a beneficiary of a family trust in Australia. I reckon half of expats around the world will be beneficiaries of their families or their parents' family trust. They probably don't even know. So if they spent more than 45 days in Australia and they're a beneficiary of their family trust, guess what? Bingo, you're a tax resident. So I think you're spot on. I think they opened up a bit of a Pandora's box there when they looked at it in more detail and said, oh, wait a minute, you could drive a bus through some of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's back to the drawing board. I think I'll be very curious to see what happens, because obviously it affects every conversation I have with every expat. It's the first thing we talk about when we talk about their tax status.
Yep.
So no one's more interested in this than me, but unfortunately it's on the back burner at the moment.
So for the folks, especially in the Middle East, who are planning their summer holidays, whilst you don't want them to breach too many days in Australia, but don't worry about the 45 days for the next 12 months anyway.
Yeah, although if you want to, that the 45 days is never a rule of thumb that has ever been formally enacted, even though it was in the Board of Taxation report as a particular test. That most recent key case that was unsuccessfully appealed, well, the appeal was rejected, shows that
Yep.
even people within Australia for a short period of time, and I think he averaged about 53 days or something per year, can be deemed as a resident if the circumstances on a more broader basis support that.
Yeah, and just for the folks on the call, Ben's referring to a recent case where a gentleman based in Dubai, I think it was 6 or 7 years he'd been here, was recently
5
deemed
years it was.
5 years, sorry, 5, yes, 2019 I think it was, wasn't it? Recently deemed a tax resident, even though he went to great lengths to be seen to be a non-resident. And we'll probably do a big blog post pulling that apart, because the lengths that they went to, including inspecting his furniture to see whether it was IKEA or not and how temporary it was. And I've never seen that before. That was really surprising. That was a real shock to the system. So we'll do a blog post later on that one there, but that's one that hasn't actually received a lot of airtime, but I think caught a lot of us by surprise, because, yeah, I think the sense of permanence was what they were trying to hang their hat on. He had an Najari, Emirates ID, property in Australia, property in the UAE, but came back to that beneficiaries test, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, always when you've got a family back at home, that does complicate things a bit. And, they put a lot of weight on things like having 4 cars registered in his name and jet ski and a boat and whatever it was. So definitely there was things that went against him, but also having an Australian-based employer that was withholding, I think, cumulatively about 500,000 in Australian tax didn't help, because they saw exactly what the size of the prize was, and it became a pretty easy case for them to try and pick apart.
Yeah. Okay. Jeremy, one last question for you, unless we've got any other questions coming in through, please, guys, now's the time to ask. With obviously your comments before, but regarding the potential of a 50 basis point cut on interest rates, how much bigger does the scope become in terms of an Aussie expat getting a loan in Australia when you do obviously see those large reductions in official cash rates?
Yeah, so every time there's a 25-point cut, just generally speaking, it increases everyone's borrowing capacity, because the banks will look at essentially a floor rate, which is about 5.5%. But we still got the 3% assessment rate which is added on top of the interest rate that would be charged. So every time there's a 25-point cut by the RBA, if that's passed on by the bank, it sort of increases, depending on your exact assets and liabilities, but increases your borrowing capacity by about 4 to 6%. So if you double that, it's getting nearly 10% plus the 25. So that's across the market. That's for expats and for people back home. So it's no surprise that after the last cut, you saw the Melbourne and Sydney markets, I think it was only on a monthly, but they both grew slightly because, Sydney, but Melbourne used to be the case as well, but they're typically the most expensive markets. So people's borrowing capacity allows them to increase what they can actually afford in those cities.
Definitely. Okay, no, that's makes sense, doesn't it? Because, obviously it comes back to serviceability and the multiplier effect.
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Righty, guys. Well, if there's no other questions, we might wrap it up there and let everyone get on with the day. For those Atlas clients on the call, just a reminder, we've got our Trump briefing happening tomorrow on markets, talking all things margin calls, ETFs, you name it. Why is the market doing what it's doing? So we look forward to seeing them on the call tomorrow for that. For those out there, both clients and obviously expats in general, we'll obviously be doing a follow-up to the election next month, and we'll discuss in more detail. I mean, this has been a very light on presentation as far as we're concerned, and wasn't a great deal to jump into, but I dare say over the next 3 to 4 weeks, we'll have a lot more to chew through, and we'll make sure we let everyone know. Obviously, everyone will know who wins, but how that winning party will affect Australian expats managing their finance affairs. So thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Ben, for joining us on the call today, and really appreciate everyone attending, and we'll keep an eye out on your emails for a copy of the recording, but also to further updates as we go through. Thanks, guys. Take care.
Thank you.
you.
Cheers.